a foundation for faith in the midst of our present suffering. And that phrase, present suffering, comes right out of Romans 8, and really a key verse in Romans 8, where the Apostle Paul says, "For I consider, or I have concluded, out of all of the suffering that he experienced, all of the ways that God spoke to him as an apostle, as he planted churches, as he took the good news about Jesus and he took it deeply into his heart and he reflected on it. It was his whole life." And Paul made this statement that I have concluded, I have considered deeply and long and hard, and I've come to this conclusion that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed. And then a whole lot in Romans chapter 8 just flows from that. And we've been looking at that, just that God has a plan. God has made provision for us. He has a plan. He offers us an eternal perspective. He gives permission. And we're going to review all of those things in just a moment. And today specifically, we're going to look at a particular promise or a group of promises that God makes to us that provide part of this foundation for faith. But I want to start by telling you a story. Story about a boy. When the story begins, or at least this part of the story, a 17-year-old. If I want to hide who he really is, I could call him Joe. Joe lived in a really large family. He had a whole lot of brothers. I think about 11 of them. 10 of them were older than him. And some of you already are saying, "Oh, I think I know where you're headed with this." Joe was kind of the favorite of all of his family. And while his older brothers had to go out and work in the field, Joe's life was pretty easy. He got to stay home. And in fact, he was such a favorite that his father made this special coat for him. A beautiful coat, many different colors. And by now you're saying, okay, you're not talking about Joe, you're talking about Joseph. And you're right. We know him as Joseph, an Old Testament figure, but everything I've described is part of his story. But at the age of 17, everything suddenly changed in his life out of the blue. It wasn't a virus. He had been sent to check on his brothers, and his brothers were a little bit envious of Joseph. And they were miles away from home taking care of some livestock, and they saw Joseph coming from a distance. They recognized it was him, and they decided, this guy is he's always just irritated us. He's Dad's favorite. He always has these dreams, and he talks about how he's going to be above us, and we're going to bow down to him. And you know what? I think it's time to do something about Joseph. And they did the unthinkable. They first of all they threw him in a pit, and then some of them wanted just to kill him. And one of his brothers appealed and say, "Oh, let's not do that." And they saw a caravan coming by, and they thought, "Well, hey, we won't kill him. We'll get some money from him." And they sold him. They sold him to this caravan of traders, and he wound up being taken down to Egypt, and he was sold as a slave. And for the next about 13 years, part of that time he was serving in the household of a man named Potiphar. Then he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, was thrown into Pharaoh's dungeon. And it wasn't until a total of about 13 years later, about 30. All that time he was in service. He was not free, was not necessarily in the dungeon. We don't know exactly the timing of just exactly how long he was serving Potiphar before he was put in prison. But we're talking years. We get a little antsy with the current quarantine conditions. It's only been 2 months. And I know that's a lot of time, but that's only been 2 months. And we can still go outside. We still have a lot of freedom. We can still get what we need from the store. We can still get essential things. Joseph didn't have that freedom, and especially the time, at least 2 years, probably much longer than that, probably 8 years, maybe 10 years, that Joseph was in the dungeon. And there's not a lot of freedom there. That's kind of an extreme quarantine. And so I want us to think about Joseph's story, and we're going to come back to that when we think about a foundation for faith in the midst of our present of our present suffering. And present suffering takes a lot of different forms, and I've talked about what it was like for Joseph. That was a very real and very, very present suffering for him. But even in the midst of that, Joseph demonstrated remarkable faith. And all through the account in Genesis of Joseph's life, even during these hardships, Joseph, time and time again, it says that Joseph trusted wholeheartedly in God, and he sought to live a life by God's principles, and he sought to honor God in all that he did. You say, well, how could he do that in such present suffering? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to review just a little bit where we've been, and just to remind us here, we've talked about the foundation for our faith is in God's provision, and we see that in the book of Romans, early in Romans 8, God's provision for our eternal salvation through Jesus Christ, and that's part of the foundation. That even if our life here, or even when our life here ends, we have promise and hope beyond this life. So this is a provision for all of eternity, provision for our eternal salvation through Jesus Christ. That's part of our foundation. Our foundation is also based on God's plan, a plan which surprisingly includes the presence of suffering. And we may not fully understand that, and I don't fully understand that. But what God tells us is that part of his plan is it's a plan that transforms suffering into glory. And I'm not going to go back over all of that, but it just says God can take times of suffering, and God can take these things and can bring beauty out of them, and can use them, can kind of turn them around and use them for great good. And that's part of our foundation of faith. Then we talked about God's perspective, and I already alluded to this in the scripture about our present suffering and the glory that will be revealed, and how there's just no comparison. And God offers us that perspective, and that's part of our foundation of faith, that the present suffering simply do not compare with the glory that will be revealed. And I realize we may be talking about that glory in eternity. Sometimes we don't see that here in this life. Sometimes God gives us glimpses. Sometimes God actually shows us how he uses some difficulty in our life and uses that to open a door for us to be a blessing to someone else, or for God to do some work in our life, or to redirect us in some way. And we look back and we say, wow, that's just amazing, God, what you did when I thought this was such a terrible thing in my life. And I have stories like that. There are times I can think as a teenager, a major time in my life when God redirected my life against my will. And I was in a place I didn't want to be, and I thought that my life was coming, not literally, but my happiness was coming to an end. But God used that circumstance in a way to redirect me and to bring me greater joy, greater purpose. And so that's part of this perspective here, that our present suffering does not even compare with the greater glory that God promises. And then there's God's permission, and this can be really meaningful to us in the midst of everything else. And you say, well, what do you mean God's permission? But Romans 8 speaks very clearly that God gives permission for us to acknowledge how hard life sometimes is and how much it hurts. I'm going to say that again. God's permission is for us to acknowledge how hard life sometimes is and how much it hurts. And that's what I appreciated about Grace and Helen sharing is they weren't just saying, oh, everything's fine, I trust in God. They were saying, no, everything's not fine. And I really am afraid, and I really do miss these things, but still I trust in God. And that's what God calls us to do, is in the midst of our anxiety, of our fears, it's okay to acknowledge these concerns, to acknowledge our fears, but he calls us to stand on a foundation of faith. Beneath all of that, there's this solid foundation that will not crumble. And part of that foundation is that God says it's okay. It's okay to acknowledge how hard life sometimes is and to acknowledge how much it hurts. But then for the remainder of our time this morning, I want to talk about God's promises. Now, there are promises already inherent in what we've looked at in just this review, promises about eternal life, promises about future glory, all of that. But this is another part of the passage in Romans 8, really one of the most familiar verses in the whole chapter. And that verse is summed up in this, that God's promise is that he works in all things for our good. I'm going to get just a little sip to drink here. And we're going to dig a little deeper into this verse. The verse itself is as follows. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Familiar verse, but it's not one that I say glibly. It's not one that I just say, oh, don't worry, everything's going to work fine, because this whole chapter of Romans 8 acknowledges that life is sometimes hard and that life hurts. And sometimes the only appropriate response is what Paul in this chapter calls groaning, and how we groan inwardly because of the pain and the suffering in this life. He says, even as we wait eagerly for what God has promised, we still have these times where we're groaning because it's hard and it hurts. And so this is not just some glib, cliche just to say, oh, stop worrying. But this is part of a deep foundation of faith, that even when we don't see it, God is working. Even when we don't feel it, God is still working for good. So I want to get back to the story, and then we're going to look a little more into this passage. But I'm going to keep this verse on the screen. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the story of Joseph. So we last left him. He's in Egypt. He's in Pharaoh's dungeon, and through this miraculous turn of events, Joseph gets released from prison. Two fellow prisoners there, a baker and a cupbearer, I believe they were, and they had dreams while they were in prison, and they were trying to figure out what they meant. And Joseph said, well, the God I serve, I believe he'll give me wisdom to interpret your dreams. And he did. And the interpretation, one of them was going to be released and returned to his former position, serving Pharaoh as the cupbearer. The baker was actually going to be executed. Not real happy news for him, but they both turned out exactly as Joseph said the dreams were telling. And he did ask the cupbearer, he says, when you are restored to your position, put in a good word for me. Well, time went by, a few years went by, and the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph. But then came the day when Pharaoh had a dream, and none of his wise men, none of his astrologers, no one in the kingdom could tell him the meaning of the dream. And finally, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. He said, oh, Pharaoh, there's this man in the prison, in the dungeon. Told him about what had happened. And so Pharaoh sent for him. Joseph interpreted, God gave Joseph the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, that there would be 7 years of plenty and abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, well, what should I do? And Joseph said, well, I think you should appoint someone who's wise to be in charge of all of this. You should store up grain in the 7 years of abundance, and then you will have plenty laid aside for the 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh said, well, I can think of nobody in the whole kingdom wiser than you. And so in one day, Joseph went from being in the king's dungeon to being essentially the prime minister of all of Egypt. That's not the end of the story. God was working all that time. He was working, preparing Joseph. He was working, bringing circumstances to bear, working for the time when Joseph would be released from the dungeon. But that's not the end of the story. Joseph's family, his father and his 11 brothers, are still down in Canaan. And when the famine comes, they don't have food. They didn't know it was coming like Joseph and Pharaoh did. They run out of food, and so Joseph's father sends his 10 older brothers down to Egypt because he's heard that they've got grain there that they can sell. And so long story short, after several trips and Joseph recognizes them, eventually Joseph reveals himself to them and they think, oh no, he's going to pay us back. And he doesn't. And instead he says, go get your families, your father, move down here to Egypt. And God has ordained this. God has used what you meant for evil. God intended for good, to help save your lives, save all of our lives, to help us be able to come together, to live here in Egypt, and to have all that we need to sustain through this time of famine. So Joseph actually, even after their father died and his brothers thought, well, now that our father's dead, he's going to pay us back. Joseph said, no. He said, what you intended for evil, God was working it out. God intended it for good. And God was able to use that. It didn't mean it was a good thing that they did, but God was able to use that and to bring good out of it. So we want to look again at this passage just for a few moments yet. Again, Paul says, we know that in all things. So just let me look at this piece by piece. First, he says, we know. He says, we don't, he doesn't say we think, we're imagining, or wouldn't it be nice if? He says, no, we know. And then the second thing, we know that in all things. He doesn't say for all things. He doesn't say all things are good. He doesn't say we know that all things are good. He says we know that in the midst of the present suffering, in the midst of any circumstance, God is working. God works for the good, not always pleasant, but for deeper good, for good that is consistent with God's plan and purpose. And so this passage says, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. Now we look at the next verse and it starts to show us a little bit more of what that purpose is. Now there's a lot of deep language and deep concepts here. We're not going to go into all of them, but Paul wrote, for those God foreknew, said God kind of knew ahead of time those who would love him. And there's a lot more into this. And again, not gonna solve all of your questions here, but he says, for those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. The main point I want to lift out here is this talks about God's purpose. It says God's purpose, when the verse right before that, it says that God is working in all things, working for the good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose. Well, that's what this purpose is. This purpose is that God has predetermined. God's purpose is that you and I be conformed to the image of his son, that we become like Christ. So whatever God is doing at work in our lives is to help us be more like Christ. And he says, so that Jesus, the Son, might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters, so that through his life and death and the salvation that we have through him, and as we answer Christ's call to follow him, we become more and more like him. And that's God's purpose. That's God's vision in this world, is that we are Christ's body. Collectively with one another, we are part of his body here on the earth, and that we reflect the love, the truth, the grace of Christ to the world around us. That's God's purpose for us. And in the midst of any form of present suffering, God is working to accomplish that in greater and deeper ways in our lives. And then the following verse just reminds us, and again, some things we could spend months talking about, but verse 30 says, it just continues that thought. It says, and those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. And my main point here in highlighting this verse is just to say, here's the progression that even from the beginning, God saw all of these steps in providing for our salvation that we've already looked at. God saw all these steps of making us more into the image of his son. And the culmination of all of this, it says, is to be glorified, is to is to receive that glory that God spoke of, is to share in the fullness of God's glory. We get glimpses of that in life, but the greatest part of that is in all of eternity, when there'll be no more sickness, no more pain, no more death, and we have that promise. Promise not only that God is working in the midst of present suffering to bring about good, but promise that at the end, that all of this suffering eventually will be transformed into a greater glory. And that's all part of his promise here. So I just want to summarize these scriptures, and then we're gonna finish for today. What are God's promises in these three verses? First, there are promises that, as we already said, that he works in all things for our good. That's promise number one. And right behind that is the promise that central to our good is that you and I be formed into the image of Jesus. That's the greatest good that God has for us. God cares about every part of our life, but he especially cares about who we are on the inside. He cares about that we not be consumed by fear, but that beneath all of the fear and in the midst of all the fear is this foundation of faith, and he wants to deepen that. He cares that we not respond to fear and respond to the current circumstances by just becoming all self-absorbed and just concerned about ourselves. He cares that Christ is formed in us and that we care for other people like Christ cared for us. All of these things central to our good, to the good that God is working, is that you and I become more and more like Jesus. Also, God promises that if we are in Christ, that if we have placed our faith and trust in him, we are called and justified in him, then our future glory is certain. That's part of God's promise. Same God who predestined, who called, who justified, has glorified. In God's eyes, it's as though it's already done. It's that certain, and that future glory is part of God's promise, and it is certain. And then lastly, this morning, God promises that absolutely nothing in the present or in the future can separate us from his love. You might say, well, I don't remember reading that in the verses we looked at. Well, that's because we didn't. That's what we're going to look at next week, when we look at the last part of this foundation of faith in times in the midst of present suffering. We've looked at God's provision, God's promise, God's provision, God's plan, God's perspective, God's permission, God's promises, and next week we're going to look at God's presence, and just a tremendous message of hope that is, as you see God's greatest promise to us is his presence with us, his love for us, and we're going to dig deeper into that next week. So I hope this has been an encouragement to you. Thank you again for joining with us, for sharing this time together. This will be, we'll stay on our Facebook page. If there's people you want to share it with, you can send them back to this. It'll be a video. We'll save it there. And hopefully, if all the technology works for us, we'll also put it on our website. You can find a lot of other things on our Facebook page and on our website as well. Reach out to us if there's anything we can help you with. If we